Final book review by Michael Chiango for Intro to Sociology class. Caste, The Origin of Our Discontents by Isabel Wilkerson. Caste, The Origin of Our Discontents, a Pulitzer Prize-winning book by author Isabel Wilkerson, was published on August 4, 2020, and looks at the history of the caste system of the United States of America and compares it to the caste systems established in India and Nazi Germany. The year of 2020 was an eye-opener for many people, as it is the year that many Americans took notice of extremely problematic aspects of our society that had previously been swept under the rug. Disaster after disaster and failure after failure, with an inability of the country to properly respond, has led many people to question what could have gone so wrong in the nation of the United States. I myself have been forced to reevaluate much due to the circumstances of 2020, and I have become much more educated on the long-lasting systemic shortcomings of the American experiment. In addition to the pandemic, the economic crisis, and the attacks on the democratic process, one issue that was brought to the forefront in 2020 was racial justice, prompted by a bystander video released of a police officer murdering an unarmed black man named George Floyd by placing his knee on his neck for several minutes. Outrage came in the form of violent riots in some locations, but mostly peaceful protests by those in support of the Black Lives Matter activism. While many Americans would prefer to believe that racism is a thing of the past, the events of the past several years have reminded us that it isn't, and the shadows of our racist past can easily flare up like a fire if given oxygen, such as the President of the United States dog-whistling to his white supremacist supporters. However, although racial hatred and bigotry towards African Americans is still very prevalent and problematic today, the true underlying problem to point to when discussing events such as the murder of George Floyd and the heavily biased law enforcement and criminal justice system is caste. While race is a loosely defined category based on perceived biological differences between groups of people, the caste system is a structural system of social stratification that determines the status of individuals based on their family history. While caste system would most often recall images of the Indian caste system for people, the United States too has a caste system, just as Nazi Germany did, with so-called African Americans as the untouchables, and the effects of this caste system still cut deep into the nature of America itself. This book employs the sociological perspective, digging deeper than the surface level and recognizing larger trends in society that serve as reminders of the hierarchical nature of the American caste system. The sociological perspective that shines through most in Wilkerson's analysis is conflict theory, a paradigm that sees social conflict as the basis of society and social change, and emphasizes a materialist view of society, a critical view of the status quo, and a dynamic model of historical change. The book is quite clear that it does us no good to deny the structural problems in our society, just as it would do us no good to deny our ailments when going in for a doctor's visit. Few problems have ever been solved by ignoring them. I definitely agree with this perspective. I think many people have genuine intentions when they say things like, "I don't see color," implying that they just don't treat race as an issue. However, while recognizing that an ideal future is one in which race is not a factor in any notion that someone might have of another person, in the present we still must face the reality that race still does play a significant part in how individuals and groups are treated in society, and work to actively address those grievances. As Wilkerson points out, race is merely the front man to caste, which is built into the structure of America, and someone choosing to disregard race as a factor is not actually solving the problem. We in the developed world are like homeowners who inherited a house on a piece of land that is beautiful on the outside, but its soil is unstable loam and rock, heaving and contracting over generations, cracked, patched, but the deeper ruptures waved away for decades, centuries even. People might rightly say, "I had nothing to do with how this all started. I have nothing to do with the sins of my past." And yes, not one of us was here when this house was built. Our immediate ancestors might have nothing to do with it, but we are here, the current occupants of a property with cracks and bowed walls and fissures in the foundation. We are heirs to whatever is right or wrong with it. We do not erect the uneven pillars or joists, but they are ours to deal with now. Page 16. Many people of the upper caste in America get defensive when claims are thrown around about white privilege and systemic racism, aka casteism, feeling as though they are being targeted for their race and blamed for things that they never contributed to. Whether a white person is actively in support of the American caste system is not the issue, however. Just as it is our responsibility to do something about climate change and environmental degradation since we live in a system that contributes to it, it is also our responsibility to do what we can to dismantle the American caste system since we are living in a system that contributes to it. In the book, Isabel Wilkerson goes through the long, complicated, and brutal history of the American caste system, which began all the way back in colonial Virginia before the United States was even conceived. The colonists needed slaves for the labor-intensive work, and after failing to successfully enslave the native population, Africans were forcefully brought into the continent to serve the white settlers, while the Native Americans were driven out of their lands to make way for the colonists. Slavery was not merely an unfortunate thing that happened to black people, it was an American institution created by and for the benefits of the elites of the dominant caste, and enforced by poor members of the dominant caste who tied their lot to the caste system rather than to their consciousness. Page 44. Initially, religion served to establish the differences between the Christian Europeans and the savages and heathens of the Africans and the Native Americans. However, once some Indians and many African Americans began converting to Christianity, a new means was created to justify the brutal repression of the lower castes, and thus the concept of race was conceived. Arriving immigrants to the States, from Germany and Ireland first, and then from other European nations, were once looked down upon and discriminated against, however eventually became assimilated into the dominant caste due to being the same race, or skin color, as the other white Americans, while black Americans remained squarely at the bottom of the caste system for hundreds of years, differentiated by their dark skin and being completely cut off from any possible way of accruing respect and wealth in the nation. This aspect of history can be used to counter those who argue that even though black people were robbed of many opportunities in the past, they should just be able to pick themselves up by their bootstraps and carve out a decent life for themselves, just like many of the dirt-poor European immigrants did when they came to America. The difference is that those European immigrants were able to be assimilated into the dominant caste system and thus had many more privileges available to them than black people, whose ancestors had been living in the nation for centuries, did not. Race, of course, is well accepted by geneticists and anthropologists as pseudoscientific nonsense, but it still plays a big part in justifying the American caste system even today. Something else I appreciate about this book is that it does not shy away from how disturbingly cruel the caste system in the United States was, which I feel makes it a good book for people to read who claim that the United States was not particularly cruel in its racial policies and was simply doing what all the other nations of the world at the time were doing. While there are some who deny the United States' great injustices of the past, many more in the nation instead try to downplay, arguing that was just the norm in the past. However, while it is true that for many places in the world the past was a much more brutal and unjust era, the United States had set up a system of racial oppression so uniquely cruel and rigorous that the Nazis took primary inspiration from it. In debating how to institutionalize racism in the Third Reich, wrote the Yale legal historian James Q. Whitwin, they began asking how the Americans did it. Page 78. Chapter 8 of the book, Nazis and the Acceleration of Caste, shows just how similar the American caste system created by the Nazis was to the caste system in the United States. Very intentionally so, as Adolf Hitler was known to have great admiration for white America, and how it committed genocide of the Native Americans, pushing them off their lands, and making certain that black people were oppressed and completely segregated from the white population, even after slavery had ended. In fact, there were many aspects of the American caste system that were even more uncompromising and brutal than the Nazi caste system was, which held that someone with 1/4 Jewish ancestry had tainted blood, while in America, even 1/16 of Negro blood tainted a person. Chapter 9, The Evils of Silence, gives incredibly disturbing scenes that took place in the United States and in Nazi Germany, and prompts the audience to think about just how similar the scenes from the two nations are to one another. This was singularly American. Even the Nazis did not stoop to selling souvenirs of Auschwitz. Lynching postcards were so common a form of communication in the turn of the 20th century America, that lynching scenes became a burgeoning subdepartment of the postcard industry. Page 93. The great evils of Germany's past are directly addressed with shame in Germany today, but in the United States these evils remain in silence, not often fully addressed by the educational system, and not often thought about by the public. History is full of so many examples of inhumane cruelty visited upon others, and seeing as how patriotism is so intertwined with the character of the nation, Americans have the tendency of seeing their country as above cruelty and barbarity visited by other nations of the past. I have encountered many people in my own life who claim in one way or another that the United States is exceptional because it has a bright past and never went down the dark and brutal paths that so many other civilizations fell prey to. It is unlikely that these people are aware of the fact that Andrew Jackson, the 7th President of the United States, used bridle reins made of the flesh of skinned Native Americans when he went horseback riding. The state of Alabama still had laws against interracial marriage all the way back to the turn of the century. That showcases just how much racial oppression is baked into the character of the nation. Isabel Wilkerson goes into detail in the book about how something so unjust as a national caste system can be justified and upheld. One main factor is the use of religion for perverse purposes. The caste system of India has its roots in the Hindu religion, which tells of the different classes of people created out of the different parts of Brahma, the god of creation, as well as the untouchables, who were never a part of Brahma at all. In the case of America's caste system, though there was no direct establishment of it in the Bible, religion was still used to justify the segregation of the races from one another through interpretation of God and Scripture by white Christians. The great architect had framed them both physically and mentally to fill the sphere in which they were thrown. His wisdom and mercy combined in constituting them thus suited to the degraded position they were destined to occupy. Page 103. God had created the Negro race with a certain purpose in mind, so elevating black people above their natural stature was an offense to God. The second son of Noah, Ham, was cursed by God, and many Christians interpreted this biblical story to justify the lowly treatment of African Americans, because all black people were supposedly descended from Ham. Nazi Germany was about 95% Christian by 1939, so there too religion was used to advance the creation of the caste system. Religiously based anti-Semitism was endemic all throughout Europe for over a millennium, so the citizens of Germany were already primed for the oppression of the Jewish people. Nazi propaganda also co-opted Christianity, claiming that the Aryans were God's chosen people destined to cleanse the world of degeneracy and heathenism, and portraying the figure of Jesus himself as Aryan. Religion can be an incredibly powerful tool in justifying the unjustifiable, since one can simply default to the idea that God knows best and he wants the different peoples in society to be ordered in certain ways, with the people who hold all the power in society conveniently being the ones making those arguments. Caste systems have to be organized in certain ways to make it so that there is no way that those members of a lower caste can obtain honor and status equivalent to members of a higher caste. This is done through the systematic removal of any financial opportunities for the lower castes, as was seen all throughout the nation, but especially in the South after slavery was finally abolished. The lowest caste was put to work doing the hardest labor and gaining very little in return. Just as enslaved and malnourished Africans had to drain the swamp, chop down the trees, clear the land to build the plantation infrastructure of the South, the starving captives of the Third Reich had to drain the swamp, chop down the trees, dig up the roots, carry logs, and build the infrastructure of their torment. Isabel Wilkerson also points out one other crucial aspect of a caste system, which is that in addition to the dominant caste being in support of it, which is not particularly difficult to promote, there also must be some Uncle Toms, for lack of a better term, of the lower caste who are willing to selflessly ensure their own well-being in aiding and strengthening the caste system for their oppressors. In Nazi Germany, there were Jews who were put in charge of supervising and subjugating their fellow Jews in return for special exceptions and rewards for themselves. For another example, in modern-day America, there are black people such as Jesse Lee Peterson and Candace Owens who have become very wealthy and successful by advancing conservative talking points about how systemic racism in America doesn't exist, which are then bolstered by the fact that they are coming from people who are supposed to be victims of systemic racism. The most potent instrument of the caste system is a sentinel at every rung, whose identity forswears any accusation of discrimination, and helps keep the caste system running. Page 244. Something else that Wilkerson addresses in the book is the discrepancy between how racism manifests in modern day versus how it manifested in the past. Some people are under the mistaken impression that racism is only defined by an outward hatred towards another race and the belief that one race is inferior. However, that is a perception utterly devoid of nuance and completely disregards the degrees of racial prejudice. Not only does racism not take the form of open and active hate towards racial minorities in the modern day, outside of more extremist groups still around like the KKK, but racism is also not just a character flaw to be corrected individually. What we face in our current day is not the classical racism of our forefathers' era, but a mutation of the software that adjusts to the updated needs of the operating system. Page 68. Racism can take the form of subconscious bias, with many people legitimately not seeing themselves as racist, but still harboring certain demeaning attitudes towards minority groups. This can be seen in studies where job applications are sent out with equal qualifications, but the one with a black-sounding name gets rejected more often than the one with the white-sounding name. Despite open hateful racism being much more thoroughly shunned in society than it once was, racial wealth disparities are still incredibly prominent, with black households owning an average of 10 times less than white households in the U.S. After so much progress has been made in the nation towards equal rights, African Americans are still unequivocally on the bottom rung of the ladder. The caste system in America is 400 years old, and it will not be dismantled by a single law or any one person, no matter how powerful. We have seen in the years since the Civil Rights era that laws like the Voting Rights Act of 1965 can be weakened if there is not a collective will to maintain them. Page 380. Also, just because it might not be as powerful as it was in the past, bigoted and hateful sentiments are still very prominent in many white people in the United States. Because open racism is mostly seen as unacceptable in mainstream American culture today, the use of dog whistles is common to lend to plausible deniability, such as how Donald Trump often used them when trying to appeal to his base, like when he fear-mongered about the suburbs being taken over. However, especially in recent years, public displays of open racism and hatred of minorities has become more common, with people marching through the streets and rallies carrying the American flag, the Confederate flag, and the Nazi symbol together. The book gives a very illustrative example of how our nation never truly grew beyond the racism of our past with the treatment of Confederate leaders after the Civil War. After Nazi Germany was defeated, many of Hitler's officers were hanged, Nazi statues and propaganda were destroyed, and Germany paid reparations to the new state of Israel. There are about 1,700 Confederate monuments across the United States. The surviving leaders of the Confederacy went on to live out their lives in relative comfort, having schools, monuments, and libraries named after them, and the southern states were paid reparations by the North rather than the people that they were enslaving. One event cataloged by Wilkerson saw the city of New Orleans in the South go into great lengths to have Confederate statues removed, which proved to be difficult because all the contractors that considered doing so received threatening attacks, and the contractor that did decide to do it pulled out after his car got firebombed. It is clear that there is still much race-based fear and angst in the nation, and it seems to me that the presidencies of both Obama and Trump have succeeded in stoking it, in different ways, of course. I have witnessed this great fear coming from people in my own life who believe that there is a dangerous campaign being launched against white people in the country, and there must be some way to address that fear in people to prevent the nation from tearing itself apart as the white majority continues to get smaller and smaller. Although this book primarily focuses on how the caste system of the United States has harmed African Americans, the title of the book is called Caste, the Origin of Our Discontents. The R part is important as it implies that the caste system is destructive towards society as a whole and not merely those at the bottom rung. Isabel Wilkerson addresses the harm that the caste system does on members of the upper caste by remarking on how lower-class white people in the United States felt as though they needed the caste system most of all. The caste system was their consolation that even though they might be poor and not have access to the same opportunities that wealthier people did, at least they were still better than the lowly Negro. The disestablishment of the caste system would have meant that they would become the lowest of the low in society. In the zero-sum stakes of a caste system upheld by perceived scarcity, if a lower-rung caste person goes up a rung, an upper caste person comes down. The elevation of others amounts to a demotion of oneself, thus equality feels like a demotion. Page 183. The great irony of all this is that racial issues have often been an effective tool used by the wealthy and powerful to maintain their status in society. A poor white person and a black person would seem to have much more in common with each other than a poor white person would with a rich plantation owner, but when capitalism in the United States intermingled with the caste system, it created a situation where lower-class whites and African Americans were more busy fighting each other than campaigning together for greater labor rights and economic protections. The New Deal era of the United States marked a clear shift in what people expected the job of the government to be. No longer would the government sit idly by and let the free hand of the market smooth out the rough edges of the economy, and instead the government would be responsible for aiding the citizenry when they needed it, through reforms like the Social Security Act of 1935 and the Wagner Act. However, these New Deal reforms were highly discriminatory towards African Americans and mostly benefited those in the dominant caste, in stark contrast to the view of many people that black people are disproportionately living in poverty because government handouts are making them lazy. The sad reality is that the reason why many beneficial government programs are blocked from passing is because many white people fear that they will give black people a leg up over them, seeing poor as a synonym for black despite possibly being in poverty themselves. No way I want my tax dollars paying for Mexicans or welfare queens. Ain't no way I would ever support Obamacare or sign up for it. I would rather die. Page 189. Caste has almost everything to do with why the United States is the way it is, why it is a less benevolent and harsher society than other developed nations, why it is seen as taking away from one's own prosperity if the system looks out for everyone. In no major developed country in the world does a mainstream conservative party question the morality and efficacy of universal health care outside of the United States. This voting against one's own interest could be very clearly seen in the 2016 election, as Donald Trump, known for his racial dog whistles and xenophobic rhetoric, gained more populist support than Bernie Sanders, someone who campaigned for both racial justice and policies that would benefit the poor and working class. The caste system in America, as well as in India and Nazi Germany, and the horrors released upon the lower castes because of them, were the product of a powerful majority that was open to being persuaded that oppressing those in the lower castes would make their lives better, and many in the upper caste went on to face the consequences of the hierarchical society their ancestors created, in addition to the much more serious consequences that the members of the lower castes would face. Isabel Wilkerson sums it up more perfectly than I ever could. The friction of caste is killing people. Social inequality is killing people. The act of moving about and navigating spaces with those whom society has trained us to believe are inherently different from us is killing people, and not just the targets. Studies show us that prejudice itself can be deadly. The species has suffered incomprehensible loss over the false divisions of caste. The 11 million people killed by the Nazis, the 3/4 of 1 million Americans killed in the Civil War over the right to enslave human beings, and the slow living death and unfulfilled gifts of millions more on the plantations in India and the American South. There are two minor complaints that I would levy against this book. The first is that while the author Isabel Wilkerson does a good job of focusing on the systemic and wide-reaching inequalities that the caste system breeds, in her work she can at times drift into the territory of talking about more minor grievances, which don't seem to be that significant. She gives examples of microaggressions against her that she experienced, and at a few points of the book, it can come across that she is merely venting and expressing how difficult her experience has been as a black woman in America, rather than sticking to discussing the historical aspect of the caste system and how it has shifted and changed to accommodate new developments in society. The second complaint I have about the book is that it focuses a lot on the relationship between people of European ancestry and those of African ancestry, but does not do much to address other racial groups that exist in the United States and how they fit into the caste system. Ethnicities such as Asian Americans, Latin Americans, Arabic Americans, and even the original Native Americans were not given any kind of focus comparable to African Americans in their relationship to white Americans, which was disappointing for me because I was pulled into the book with the idea of an American caste system and didn't get much of an explanation on the middle rungs. Going in with much more knowledge about the mistreatment of African Americans in the country than any other racial identity, I wanted to gain a more in-depth knowledge than that black people are on the bottom and that white people are on the top. Still, those are minor complaints, and this book was overall a very valuable and enthralling resource that was very educational, and while I was already somewhat aware of some of the things that were discussed in it, Isabel Wilkerson had an incredible way of bringing to light the true scope of the problem of caste in America that I didn't realize before now was the source of so many of our discontents in society. Regardless of the content, Isabel also has an incredible skill with the English language that she uses to great effect to illustrate her arguments, and she comes into the book well equipped to offer examples and historical data to support her arguments. I recommend this book for anyone who wishes to know more about this topic.